The morning Sergeant Okafor told her she didn't belong there. It was raining. Not the kind of rain that makes people run for cover. The kind that falls straight down, steady and indifferent. The kind that doesn't care what you think of it. Sergeant First Class Tamsin Greer stood at the edge of the range at Fort Benning in that rain, her rifle case at her feet, and listened to him explain, with remarkable patience, she would later admit, why the 75th Ranger Regiment's Advanced Marksmanship program had never produced a female graduate, and why, in his considered professional opinion, it was not about to start. She said nothing. That was the thing people who knew Tamsin Greer noticed first and remembered longest. She had an unusual relationship with silence. She used it the way other people used words. Okafor finished. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and then she picked up her case and walked to the first station. He watched her go. There were 3 other instructors standing near the range shelter, and he didn't look at any of them. He looked at the back of her head until she disappeared past the berm, and then he looked at the rain. She had grown up in Timmins, Ontario, which is the kind of place that teaches you early that the world does not adjust itself to your comfort. Her father, a mechanic and a quiet man, had taken her out to his brother's property north of town when she was 9 years old, handed her a .22 rifle, and shown her how to breathe. Not how to shoot, how to breathe. The shooting, he said, was the easy part. He said, if she could control her breathing, she could control almost anything. She believed him. She believed him in the way that children believe things their parents say before they've been given reason to doubt, completely, without conditions. She enlisted at 19. She was in the top 3 of her basic training class at Fort Jackson. Her marksmanship scores came back with a note from the range master that no one in his 16 years of scoring had seen from a female trainee. She was assigned to the 82nd Airborne, served 2 tours in eastern Afghanistan, came home, applied for Ranger School, was accepted, graduated in the first third of her class, and then 2 years after pinning on her tab, applied for the Advanced Marksmanship program. The rejection came in 11 days. No explanation given. She appealed. The appeal was reviewed and denied. She reapplied. She was accepted on the second attempt, likely because the officer who had processed the first denial had rotated to a posting in Germany, and the officer who processed the second had either not seen or not cared about a notation on her file that she could never locate but that she suspected existed. This was how she arrived at Fort Benning in the rain in late October with 8 other soldiers and an instructor named Okafor who had decided before she fired a single round that she was not going to make it. The program ran 16 weeks. It was not publicly listed as a selection course, but it functioned as one. The unofficial attrition rate was about 40%. The official graduation threshold was a composite score across 8 disciplines: static, long-range precision, moving target acquisition, environmental adaptation, low-light performance, concealment and stalking, range estimation, wind reading, and what the program called operational application, a live-fire scenario that combined elements of all the others. The other 8 candidates were a staff sergeant named Burrell, who had come out of 3rd Special Forces Group, a sergeant named Adebayo who was built like a door and spoke in a way that made every statement sound like a question, a specialist named Tran who was 22 years old and seemed genuinely unaware that anything happening around him was difficult, and 5 others, Falk, Deschaines Cooper, Wexler, Pringle, and a staff sergeant named Holst who had the particular quality of making rooms feel smaller just by entering them. None of them said anything to Greer on the first day. Not unkind, not kind. They processed her the way soldiers process variables, noted, filed, returned to later. Holst made his position clear at the end of the first week. He didn't say anything directly. He said it in the way he positioned himself at the range table, the way he found reasons to be standing near Okafor when scores were reviewed, the small and consistent theater of a man managing the optics of his opposition. He was good at it. He had probably been doing it for a long time. Greer noticed. She noticed everything. She had learned that skill before she learned to shoot. The second week, she posted the highest score in the cohort on the static long-range precision exercise. The target was at 1,100 yards. She put 3 rounds into a group you could cover with a playing card. Okafor reviewed the scores that evening. The next morning, he told her that her grouping was technically impressive, but that her position sequence had shown a deviation in natural point of aim that would matter under time pressure. He said this would be recorded as a procedural flag in her evaluation. She asked him to show her the documentation of the deviation, what specifically had been observed, and when it had been logged relative to when the scores were calculated. He told her that evaluator observations were recorded continuously and were not subject to candidate review. She said she understood that. She said she was asking a procedural question about documentation sequence, not requesting access to evaluator notes. There was a pause, not a long one. The kind of pause that happens when someone says something that is technically unanswerable. He said the documentation was consistent with program standards. She said thank you and walked to the next station. Burrell was watching from about 40 feet away. He looked at the back of her head the way Okafor had on the first morning. Then he went back to his scope adjustments and didn't bring it up until 3 weeks later, when he brought it up to the only person he thought would understand it. The fourth week introduced the stalking exercise. The objective was to move from a designated start point to within 200 meters of a pair of observer instructors, remain undetected for a minimum of 45 minutes, and take a confirmed shot on a target indicator without being spotted. The instructors used spotting scopes and communicated via radio with a third instructor who moved through the vegetation and could prompt a candidate to make a small movement if they were close to being found. Most candidates took between 90 minutes and 2 hours to complete the approach. One candidate from a previous cycle had taken 4 hours and 11 minutes and had still been spotted on the shot. The record for the fastest undetected approach was held by a ranger named Holst, who had set it during his own program cycle 2 years earlier at 1 hour and 7 minutes. Greer finished in 53 minutes and was not spotted. The instructor with the spotting scope, a young sergeant named Pruitt who was assisting on the exercise, called it in twice because he was not certain his radio transmission had been received clearly. He had been watching an area of ground approximately 6 meters to Greer's actual position for the last 22 minutes and had not seen her move once. He assumed she was between him and where she actually was. When Okafor confirmed the time on the official log, he wrote it accurately. He wrote it because there were 2 other people in the vehicle when it was called in, and there was a radio recording, and the log was a legal document. He wrote it without comment. He did not mention it to the group at the evening debrief. Holst found out the next morning. He found out because Pruitt mentioned it to Tran, and Tran mentioned it to Adebayo, and Adebayo, who had no particular investment in anyone's politics, mentioned it at breakfast in the general direction of the table. Holst did not react visibly. That was also a thing he was good at. By week 6, she had top 3 scores in 4 of the 8 discipline categories. In low-light performance, she was first by a margin that the scoring sheet described in the colorless language of military documentation as statistically notable. The low-light exercise ran from 2100 to 0100 hours on a clear night in November. Candidates were positioned at staggered distances from a series of targets, irregular shapes at ranges between 600 and 1500 yards, and given a 4-hour window to confirm as many shots as possible. Wind was variable out of the northwest at 8 to 12 knots, gusting to 18. Temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. The scope reticle provided an illuminated center dot only. No ranging marks were usable in the available light. Greer fired 22 rounds over the 4-hour period, 17 confirmed hits. The next closest candidate had 11. She had spent the previous 3 nights lying on the ground behind the barracks in the dark, not with a rifle, just lying there, letting her eyes adjust to what was actually visible rather than what she expected to see. Her father had taught her that too. He had never said it directly. He had just taken her outside once, on a night with no moon, and told her to sit still and not talk for 20 minutes. And then he had asked her what she could see, and she had listed maybe 12 things, and he had listed 40, and the lesson had been self-evident. In week 8, Holst came to her. He did not come to her directly. He came to her at the end of a range session when the other candidates had already packed out and Okafor had gone to the vehicle. He came to her while she was running a patch through her barrel, which is the kind of moment people choose when they want to say something they've been arranging for a while. He said he thought she had real technical ability. He said this without preamble, and she recognized the shape of it. The compliment that is the first sentence of something else. She kept running the patch. He said the program was designed for a certain kind of operational context. He said the guys who ran these courses had built them based on decades of field experience in conditions that were specific and demanding in ways that didn't always translate across the board. He said he was sure she understood that. She looked up at him then, not with hostility, with the specific attention of someone who is very carefully hearing exactly what is being said. She said she was familiar with the program design documentation. Yes. He said he was just being honest with her. She said she appreciated honesty. He said he thought it was worth thinking about whether the path she was on was the right one for her in the long term. She said she would give that all the consideration it deserved. He looked at her for a moment. He had probably expected something different, a crack or a capitulation, or at least a reaction he could read. She went back to her barrel. He left. She sat with what he had said for about 40 seconds. She had heard versions of it before, in training, in garrison, in the field, from men who genuinely believed they were helping and from men who knew they weren't and were doing it anyway. She had learned to distinguish between the two. Holst was the second kind, but he was sophisticated about it, which almost made it worse, except that she had stopped letting almost worse matter sometime around her second deployment. She finished the cleaning. She packed her kit. She walked back to the barracks in the dark. The operational application exercise was the final assessment. It was run individually over a 48-hour window, with each candidate assigned a sequential slot. The scenario was not disclosed in advance. Candidates were given a mission briefing at the start of their slot and a terrain map that was deliberately incomplete. They were resupplied once, at the 12-hour mark, with a water cache and a single transmission updating one piece of environmental data, usually wind or temperature. The target was a static marker at an unspecified range. Candidates were expected to determine the range themselves using the available terrain features and atmospheric data. There was a secondary target introduced at the 36-hour mark, at a range and position that required the candidate to relocate without being detected by the observer team. Most candidates spent the first night in position establishment. Most reached confirmed shot on the primary target by hour 20. The secondary target was where the exercise historically differentiated candidates. In previous cycles, 3 candidates had never acquired it at all. Greer's slot began on a Thursday at 0600. The primary target was at 1,340 yards, which she determined using a combination of a ranging reticle and a map feature comparison method. Her father had shown her using a lake and a tree line on his brother's property in Northern Ontario 15 years earlier, and for no reason she could have anticipated then. She was in position by 0900. She confirmed the shot at 11:34. She did not move from her position until 1340, when she determined that the observer team had logged her shot and was no longer maintaining surveillance on her primary location. She relocated to a shallow depression 160 meters northeast of her original hide, which put her in a position she had identified on the terrain map as the only natural line of approach for the secondary target introduction that would allow her to acquire without repositioning again. She had identified it the previous evening while the other candidates were eating. She had not mentioned it to anyone. The secondary target was introduced at 1612 hours on the second day. It was at a range she later learned was 1,680 yards, which was the longest confirmed shot distance in the program's 11-year history. The wind at that point was gusting variably out of the southwest, which meant the angle of engagement had a crosswind component that shifted between 3 and 7 minutes of angle across the course of fire. She had been watching the vegetation in the middle distance for 4 hours. Not continuously. She knew better than that, at intervals. Enough to develop a read on the pattern. Enough to know that the gusts were cycling on roughly a 40-second interval, and that the sustained wind between gusts was consistent enough to shoot in. She waited for the 4th cycle after the target indicator was placed. She fired once. The hit was confirmed by the observer team at 1641 hours. Pruitt, who was on the observer team again, said later that when the confirmation came over the radio, the 2 senior instructors in the vehicle were quiet for a moment. Not a long moment, the kind that happens when something is processed. Okafor reviewed her composite score the following morning. He reviewed it in his office with the door closed, which was not his standard practice. The score was the highest in the current cohort by 11 points. It was the 3rd highest composite score in the program's history. He sat with this for a while. He was a professional and a careful man, and he had been in the Army for 23 years, and he was honest with himself about most things, which was a quality that sometimes caused him difficulty. He thought about what he had written in her file at week 2, And he thought about what he had said at the initial range assessment in the rain, and he sat with the distance between those things and what was in front of him now. He did not adjust her score. He documented it accurately. He added no qualifications to the documentation. When the results were posted the following week, her name was at the top of the list. Below it were Burrell, Tran, Adebayo, and Wexler, in that order. Holst had withdrawn from the program in week 12, citing a shoulder injury that no one had heard about until the withdrawal form appeared. Greer looked at the posted list for about 4 seconds. Then she went to get coffee. Burrell found her in the break room. He had been thinking about what he had seen in week 2, the question about documentation sequence, the pause, the way she had said thank you and walked away. He had been carrying that around for a while and hadn't known what to do with it. He said he thought she'd had a good program. She said she thought so too. He said the stalking time was going to be talked about for a while. She said probably. There was a pause, a comfortable one, which was unusual between two people who had not spoken directly in 16 weeks. He said he wanted to ask her something, and she said he could. He said, "You knew from pretty early on that this was going to be more than just the course. You knew there was going to be the course and then whatever was layered on top of it." He said, "How did you?" And then he stopped because he wasn't sure how to finish it. She looked at him. She thought about Timmins and her father and 20 minutes in the dark with no moon and learning to see what was actually there rather than what you expected. She thought about Afghanistan and the first time a superior officer had told her she wasn't suited for something and what she had done with that, which was the same thing she always did with it. She said, "It was always just the course for me. The other stuff was someone else's problem." Burrell nodded. He turned that over for a moment. He said he thought that was probably the right way to see it. She said it was the only way she'd found that worked. The program graduation was a small administrative event. No ceremony, no formation. A handshake, a document, a notation in a service record. Okafor shook her hand. He held it for a moment longer than the standard interval. He did not say anything beyond the standard statement, but he looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her in the rain on the first morning. Different than that. She had seen that look before too, from time to time, from people who had made an assessment and been wrong about it, and who were deciding in real time what to do with that fact. She didn't make it easier for him or harder. She just received it. Outside the building, she stood for a minute in the cold. The sky over Fort Benning was low and gray, the kind of sky that looked permanent but wasn't. She had a drive back to her unit and a report to file and a recommendation letter to read from her commanding officer that she had been putting off opening because she already knew what it said, broadly, and she wanted to save the specific words for later. She put her cover on, adjusted it, picked up her bag. Somewhere behind her, inside the building, someone was talking. The voice carried through the wall. She couldn't hear the words, just the tone, measured, careful, the sound of someone working something out. She walked to her vehicle, and she drove north through Georgia in the gray November light. And the road was long, and the sky did not break. And somewhere past the state line, she turned on the radio to a station she didn't know and let it play. It was, she thought, a beginning, not of something that required announcing, just a beginning, the way most real things begin, quietly, without permission, already underway.